Hi, my name is Bob Brooks, and you are watching the Prudent Money Channel. Listen, I appreciate so much you taking the time to invest into some education. One of the biggest problems in this country is the fact that we go through 12 years of school, some go to college, we go through all these hours of education, and not 1 hour is spent educating you on how money works. And then we get out and we get a job, we get into the world, and we're trying to figure out this whole money thing. And I truly believe the difference between those who are successful long term and when it comes to money are going to be those who invest into education. And I love that's what we're doing here at the Vitality Network. It's all about education. It's not about talking about what the mainstream wants you to know. It's talking about what you need to know they're not telling you. And talk a lot about risk on the Prudent Money Radio Show. Risk in all areas and how to manage it. And I specifically talk about risk because there's not enough education on how to protect yourself from risk. And one of the things that I find in talking to people and counseling people is that they've been with an advisor that really doesn't get them, that really doesn't understand how risk works. And that's what I want to talk about today. How do you identify that? And how do you start to figure out really what your risk level is? You know, risk drives everything. It obviously drives the amount of gain and loss that you go through, whether you achieve your goals, your emotional state of being. And we'll talk a lot about emotions because I think what has happened is that you go through the dot-com bubble that burst between 2000 and 2002, and then the financial crisis 2007 to 2009 has created financial trauma. And people look at risk a lot different today, and I just don't think that the advisor community is really getting that. You know, what fails in the advisor process is the fact that you sit down and you have this very small conversation about risk when it needs to be a detailed conversation. They take a cookie cutter approach to risk, and that is the old, on a scale from 1 to 10, tell me what your risk level is. The client says, well, I'm a 6. And the advisor says, okay, I understand that, and he moves on. The problem with that is that a 6 to you may be different than a 6 to the advisor. I was talking to somebody at an investment conference just this week, and he was talking about how his client was upset about some losses, and he goes, you know, we went through the risk category, and I found out he was a 6, and I'm thinking to myself, do you even know what that means? And so it's a cookie cutter approach to risk, theoretical versus emotional. You know, I always talk about on the Prudent Money Radio Show the fact that there's a lot of textbook answers out there. You know, for instance, how much of an emergency account do you need? Well, you need 6 months worth of savings. Well, that's a textbook answer. You need to know what really applies to the individual, their particular situation. And when you talk about risk, it's about their emotional state, how they deal with loss. You got to know that. And then there's a line in the sand is never established. And what I mean by that is that if I'm talking to somebody about risk, I want to know, you know, if things go south, if things go bad, where do we pull out? Where do we adjust things? Where do we make changes? And that's not a conversation that most advisors are willing to have with a client because they don't want to talk about things going south. They want to talk about growing the investments. But it's a very important part of the conversation. Overcomplicated rating system. They take it to the extreme, and they talk about risk from technical terms, and they don't connect with the client, and they don't really get a good idea of how they feel. Not wanting the sell versus taking the time. Wanting the sell versus taking the time. This is where you run into the salesperson, and this is the person that I truly believe that you really want to avoid when it comes to working with financial advisors, because most of the time, if they are real concerned with getting to the sale, if they're really concerned with selling the product, they're not concerned with what's really what's working best in your best interest. And of course, they're talking very little about risk because they want to get on to promoting the product. And then the real reason that I think that the failure in the advisor process is they don't really have a strategy. You know, we talk about plan A versus plan B when it comes to investing. Plan A is when the market goes up, but what's your plan B if the market goes down? And if they don't have it, they're not going to talk about it. So they focus on two things when it comes to risk. Diversification. But diversification in itself, yes, that is a way to protect your portfolio against risk, but it's not a means to an end. It's not that's going to really take care of that risk strategy. But the fact that they don't have a strategy is the fact that it's really rarely talked about. The biggest downside of getting this wrong with the advisor and the investor or the client is that it's the right risk level versus the wrong strategy. And let me explain what I mean by that. is that you have somebody who's got a healthy view of risk. They can take the loss. They can endure some of the volatility. So they've got a good outlook on risk. Now, the advisor gets the risk level wrong and puts them in the wrong strategy. They lose a lot of money, and now what was a healthy look at risk, was a healthy understanding of risk, now they have no desire to take risk, and that kind of taints their decision making going forward. That, to me, is the biggest downside to getting that conversation wrong. So I've taken, and this has just been through talking to people for a number of years, and broken risk down into 5 different categories: aggressive, then growth, then moderate, then conservative, then what I call, and this is actually a new category, the safe money category. Now we're going to go through the characteristics of these different risk categories, and you start to think, which one really fits you? We'll start with the aggressive investor, and I got to tell you, there's not as many people today in this category. I think that the market volatility, the level of fear, the level of uncertainty as we look forward in this country keeps people a little bit out of this aggressive investor category. But the characteristics: wants maximum growth, is speculative, likes making big bets, is fine with losses. It's kind of a gambler's instinct. And people ask me all the time, they'll say, well, what's the difference between investing and gambling? Well, this can be a little bit on the gambling side right here as you start talking about the aggressive investor. Now, what an aggressive investor should consider is that they're going to have to frequent trading, a lot of buying and selling if you're going to be aggressive. You have to have an exit strategy. So if something goes south on you, you want to know when you're going to sell ahead of time. And then the biggest thing that an aggressive investor should consider, they need to control that sense of greed, because that can really affect decision making. Now, the growth investor, they're comfortable with loss, but they view everything on a long-term basis, and they want to do as good or better than the market. So, if the S&P 500 is their benchmark, they want to be performing as good as the S&P 500. Ideally, they want to perform better than that, and that's kind of their bogey, and that's what they're looking at. Now, what should they consider? Use stop losses. Same thing as an exit strategy. They got to know that if the market starts to drop, where would they get out? Where would they exit? Now, here's the problem with a growth investor. They typically don't pay attention to what's happening because they look at everything long term. They kind of fit into this buy and hold type of mentality, and they look at their statements every once in a while. You really got to pay more attention if you're taking that kind of risk. Then there's the moderate investor. Now, I don't have any statistics to back this up, but it's been my experience, this is where the vast majority of people and investors fall into this category. They're comfortable with loss up to a point. They want a very balanced approach in their investments. They're more concerned with achieving financial goals. They have a realistic look at loss. They understand that there's going to be ups and downs, and they can emotionally tolerate it. Now, what they should consider is everything be goal-driven. And what I mean by that is that this is where, now I think a financial plan with goals is important for everybody, but they need to know, I need to be averaging a certain rate of return and achieving a certain amount of growth each year, or on average, to get me to my retirement goal. And so they're driven by those goals, not so much driven by what the market's doing. So for instance, if the market made 25%, they needed to make 6% to stay on track. They made 7%. They're going to be content with that. There's not going to be a problem with that. They're very content because they're staying with their goals. So everything goal-driven and a plan B approach. I think that that's extremely important too. A plan A when the market's going up, but what's their strategy when the market's going down? That plan B approach is so very important. And then there's the conservative investor. Characteristics of the conservative investor: comfortable with a small amount of risk. This is one of the things that I see that advisors will get wrong when they're constructing a portfolio for somebody who's conservative. They still take too much risk. You want to have a very small exposure to risk. Wants a well-diversified approach, much like the moderate investor. Wants a 5 to 6% return, maybe a 4 to 6% return. Now, a lot of things conservative investors should consider. They should check progress quarterly. Now, most investment statements come out on a monthly basis, as you know, And that can create a little too much emotion. So I like to tell people, if you're a very conservative type of investor, look at it on a quarterly basis where you have 3 different months averaged together. A plan B approach, very important to know when to reduce risk. And then low expectations for return. Here's the problem is that, we take risk for a reason, right? We take risk to grow what we have, to work with the limited resources we have and make it grow faster by taking more risk. Well, they got to realize that if they're growing money at a lower rate of return, is that going to get them to their goals? And then remove all expectation conflicts. Now, this is an important one. I have a risk survey. In fact, you can go take it at prudentmoney.com. If you take the risk survey, I send you back a risk analysis telling you where you fit in this out of these 5 categories. And what I'm looking for is conflict. I'm looking for where they say one thing but they really mean another. So for instance, they could say that they don't want to take a lot of risk, they're very risk averse, they want to say with safe investments, and then the next question says, if the market went up 20% and you only earned 5, would you be upset or would you be content? And then they put they'd be upset. So they want to make these big returns, but they don't want to take risk. You've got to be able to settle that conflict and figure out what's behind that. You can see kind of where these conversations are very important to be having with an advisor to really get you settled in on your expectations and understand what I call your prudent money DNA when it comes to risk. So remove those conflicts, make sure that that's out of the way. Then there's the safe money investor. This is a phrase that I coined a couple of years ago because I found when talking to people that people are this risk averse today. They don't want to take a lot of risk. Characteristics: cannot handle losses. One of the litmus tests when I'm talking to people, I want to know how they're going to handle a monthly statement loss, how they're going to view that, how do they look at it from a loss of dollars or a percentage loss. I want to know how they can emotionally handle it. And if you're a safe money investor, you cannot handle losses. Satisfied with a lower growth. I was working with somebody that had done a very good job saving money and investing over the span of their career, and they didn't want to take any risk at all. But they had enough money that they could put it in these guaranteed investments, and they could pull enough income to live off of it. Now, it would have been nice to see them take that money and make it work a little bit harder for them, but to fit their emotional state when it comes to risk, they were able to not take any. And I've always said, if you have the luxury of not taking risk, then don't take it. Now, most people don't have that luxury, unfortunately. What they should consider are carefully select safe money investments. There's a big industry out there driven by the insurance industry, and there are a lot of bad guaranteed type products. You've got to know that. There's a lot of them. So you want to make sure you're choosing the best ones. There are a subset of good ones that can work really well, so make sure that you understand what you're getting into and that it works. Create a financial plan driven by low or no risk. So you got to be able to say, if I'm only want to earn 3 or 4% or whatever that low number is, how does that look goal-wise down the road? Can I pull it off? Can I make it happen? If you're not having these conversations with your advisor, this is the bottom line. You need to sit down and talk in depth and make sure that they understand, hey, this is how I feel about risk. You don't want to be focusing on the losses and what's happening. You just want to make sure that what's the expectation of how these investments are going to perform, what's the greatest downside, can I live with that, and make sure that your advisor is respecting your risk level.